Hello, this is Russ and Kitty Walden with Father's Heart Ministry. I want to answer some questions that America is asking and God's people are asking regarding current events, things that are being blazoned across the television screens and the news outlets of the day. We see sex scandals and disgrace are just overwhelming our culture today. And people are asking, what's going on in our country? Listen, God wants you to have understanding of our times. Even when instability and scandal rock our world to its foundations, it isn't our portion just to scratch our heads and just see it all as the devil at work. We have to see and find in any world happening or thing even taking place in our personal life, the hand of God, the clemency of God at work in behalf of mankind. In the last many months, the shame of sexual scandal has brought down icons in business, politics, in the media, and it seems like this is just the beginning, right? When you feel like you've seen as bad as it's going to get, something else comes and it seems just elevating exponentially. Now, is this Satan getting the upper hand, or is it the sovereignty of God at work? We have to look not just at what's coming across the news desks and what the talking heads are telling us about what's happening. We have to look back for perspective, and we have to look deeper than the 24-hour news cycle for understanding just exactly what's truly taking place and what the implications of what we see happening. Listen, my wife says anything that makes you do a double take, you better pray to interpret. And if there was ever a time when suddenly things that have been status quo for years and people that it seemed untouchable are being exposed, we want to hear what God is saying. And what does it mean, not just for those being affected, but for us? Remember this, you could have saw this coming if you were paying attention, because it is judgment. It is chastisement. But remember this, judgment first comes to the house of God. Can we look back at Christian culture and see that just as the media world, the political world, the business world is being rocked by scandal, can we look back at a time when the church was shaken in a similar way? In the scriptures, Peter said the following. Let's read 1 Peter 4:17. He said, the time has come that judgment must begin where? At the house of God. And if it first begins at us, Peter says, what shall be the end of them that obey not the gospel? Now, if we can look back from the 1980s forward and see judgment in these very areas that was manifested the church, things that were exposed, and as difficult as that was, those of us upon whom the clemency of God is abundantly available, what about those that obey not the gospel? We see what that looks like even now, and those that are not men and women known for remarkable, deep devotion and faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, and we see how they are handling such things, and we contrast it by how those in our own ranks handled such situations. In the 1980s, with the fall of PTL founder Jim Bakker, there commenced a season of exposing sexual sin, scandal, and exposure that it not only shook the church then, it has continued as a pattern of shaking the very foundations of particularly the American church. Not limited to the American church, but for the most part, for decades, over and over again. Now, if you understand God's principles you could look forward. I don't mean anticipate, but I'm saying look at the timeline and say, okay, God's hand of judgment. Was it God that exposed the Jim Baker and the Jimmy Swaggart and all? Well, of course it was. And so if it was something God was doing as chastisement and judgment, then you could look forward to say, this has to be a wave that hits the secular world. And indeed, it has. That which came as chastisement on the church in time, eventually, and now has made its way to the secular world. And that's exactly what's happening. Think about Brian Williams. Again, you have to look back. Brian Williams and now Matt Lauer being removed. What does that mean? Within politics, business, politicians, business leaders, and media personalities, we see them falling from grace now wholesale. How do you interpret that? What is the big picture? It has been said that God steps through time in 500-year strides. Now let's shift the narrative. And we're really not changing the subject, but you might think we are. God steps through history in 500-year strides, and we could actually talk at length about that, beginning with the intertestamental period between Malachi and Matthew, and moving forward approximately every 500 years and see watershed seasons of things that took place, and we've just passed one of those. Now let's think about the trajectory of history in the last 5 centuries and shift the conversation just a bit. 500 years before the Obama presidency, African slavery came to North America. Why am I bringing that up? Because what we see happening in the media, in the political world, in the business world today has implications not just for women, but implications for those of marginalized ethnicities as well. So approximately 500 years as of 1992, African slavery came to North America and the Western world originally with Christopher Columbus. We could have a long conversation about that, but I've covered that in other messages. So in 2008, after the 500-year mark was passed, we saw Barack Obama come into power. Now, in elevating a black man to the Oval Office, God is saying to the African American people, first in suffering, first in promotion. Now, I realize that there are many of you that would say God didn't put Barack Obama in the Oval Office, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, years ago, if you had asked any pundit, any intellectual observer, what the gender, I'm talking back in the 60s, the 70s, if you had asked what the gender and ethnicity of the first minority president would be, the consensus would have been, and the consensus was, that it was going to be a white woman who would take the Oval Office before any other minority representative. Instead, and inexplicably, somewhat surprisingly, it was an African American man, the first ethnic minority to take the Oval Office. An African American man, in fact, an African American man of mixed racial extraction. It's one thing of the attitudes that exist in our culture about African Americans, and we could have a long discussion about that, but even more so of those of mixed African race, which even more so would be even more marginalized, even more disparaged. And God in his sovereignty allowed this man to be elected. What was God saying? Listen, you can't just conclude that Obama becoming president didn't have God's fingerprint on it. I realize there are many of you that may think that, but if you're going to believe the scriptures, and you don't have to agree with what he did or how he did it, but if you're going to believe the scriptures, you have to be confronted by the fact that Daniel 2:21 says this: God changes the times and the seasons, and he removes kings and he sets up kings. That means man pulls the voting lever, but God decides the outcome, and he's saying something more than what is being expressed in a political agenda or ideology or what was or was not accomplished during the man's administration. God removes kings and he sets up kings, and he gives the kingdom to those whom he will. So, looking beyond political considerations, you have to see, if you believe the Bible, if you put any credence in the Bible and you think it's worth anything more than the paper that it's printed on, you have to see that if the man was elected, then at some level it was the hand of God moving to make it happen. Likewise, the rise and fall of prominent personalities today on the national scene, it's not random. It can't all be the work of the devil. God is moving by his power. And because it's something God is doing, brothers and sisters, we better posture ourselves in a place of humility and hearkening, because if we're those that stand on the sidelines gleefully rejoicing because somebody we don't agree with is suffering, we better stop and think, lest we pay a price for that lack of mercy that we're showing. We must see what God is doing from a kingdom perspective. God is moving by his power, and he's saying something to his people and to the world. Again, looking back on the prior election, not the current one and the current administration, but before that, an African-American man comes to power before any other ethnicity or minority, including a white woman, which would have thought that would have been the first minority in the Oval Office. Because God said, first in suffering, first in promotion. Before any American Indian was disadvantaged by a white man, before any other race, there has been no other race other than the African American. The Western world was built largely, major components of the Western world built on the backs of African slavery. African peoples have suffered in slavery and have suffered persecution for 500 years. And therefore, God put an African-American man in the leadership of the most powerful nation of the world before any other marginalized representative of any other marginalized people, including women. But now, the pendulum swings. Now, let's before we talk more about Matt Lauer, let's look back. Brian Williams. Here's the connection between what God is doing in regard to the African American people to what's happening in the media today. Brian Williams. According to the polls, he was one of the most respected newsmen in the media. And he was removed from his position in just a few short weeks, some time ago, in a dizzying flurry of events, an African-American man, Lester Holt, was put in his place. God is saying something. We see these events where men are focused and something is happening. You have to read that and say, what is God saying? Well, God is pursuing a program of ethnic justice. I'll lose a lot of you right about there, but just if you've got any patience at all, hold on with me just a little bit longer. From a biblical perspective, you can only conclude that God is working in behalf of marginalized peoples of the earth, just as we saw continually he has done throughout the biblical narrative. And that includes women. See, God has seen the suffering of women in our culture, just as he saw the suffering of African peoples. And he is saying enough is enough. In Matthew 24:14, Jesus said that the gospel was the gospel or good news to the nations. Now, who are the nations? That word nations that Jesus was using does not describe nation states as we know it. That word nations is where we get the word ethnicity. It's the Greek word ethnos. Now, it might be a political minefield, but I'm here to tell you that the gospel of God is the gospel to the ethnos, to ethnic groups, to the marginalized of the earth, including women. The promotion of a black man to the Oval Office and a black man, Lester Holt, to the post of one of the most powerful anchor desks in the media is by the hand of God. God is saying something. First in suffering, first in promotion. What about the events transpiring before us today in popular culture? We see these larger-than-life figures are being brought down and marginalized functionaries being promoted in their place. God is saying something. And again, that doesn't mean that God endorses what each one of these newly elevated people do or what they think. But that at a deeper level, God is working beyond their understanding, and can I submit to you, he's working beyond our understanding in many cases. Now, the Matt Lauer scandal, what does that mean for us? Here we are, late 2017. We see Matt Lauer described even by competing networks, even by Fox News, described him as the king of morning news. And here he has been exposed and removed in a lightning fast 24-hour period, very similar to what happened to Brian Williams. In this case, Matt Lauer is accused of sexual impropriety that would cause any decent person to blush. And interestingly enough, think about God replacing Brian Williams with Lester Holt. Interestingly enough, not only has a woman replaced Matt Lauer, Hoda Kotb, I may not be pronouncing her name correctly, Hoda Kotb. Not only did a woman take his place, but she is a woman of Arabic descent. Now, if there was ever a marginalized, disenfranchised, looked down upon people by men and women of all ethnicities in the United States, it's people of Arabic descent. That means something. See, if you pay attention to what many of the prophets were saying at the end of 2016 as they were looking to 2017, there was a constant thread speaking to the empowerment of women. And a season ahead in 2017 that women would come to power and to strength as never before in the United States and the world. And didn't he do it? And isn't it happening? You have to see that this ongoing exposure of sex scandal and so forth is unearthing and exposing a systemic, pervasive misogyny that is run unchecked in the land, and the church is not free from it. That is run unchecked in the land of the free, the home of the brave, for many decades and longer. God says, enough is enough. Now, let's look at the implications of Hoda Kotb replacing Matt Lauer a little bit further. As Lester Holt replaced Brian Williams at the anchor desk of NBC, we now see Hoda Kotb, and again, a woman and a person of Arabic descent, taking Matt Lauer's place. She may not be the permanent replacement, but she's the face forward in the aftermath of the instability of his removal. This is God's hand adjudicating for women who have been marginalized and objectified in the U.S. and in the Western world. Not only that, you cannot overlook the fact that Hoda is of Egyptian extraction. Most Egyptians neither identify either as white or black. Most Egyptians would identify as Arabic in ethnicity. The events of the last days have implications for Arabic peoples in the West as well, in the world that you and I live in. Arabic peoples are not overlooked by God. Arabic culture might make you nervous. Arabic peoples might make you just a little bit uncomfortable when you interact with them in the public square, but they're not overlooked by God. Perhaps, and in some ways, Arabic people are the most despised, mistrusted, and looked down upon people group in the Western world, and particularly in the United States. Because of terrorism and the wars ongoing against Islamic extremism, Arabs are looked down and they're mistrusted, as at no other time in history. And look, it's no different than the way Germans were treated and the Japanese were looked upon during World War I and World War II. God is not only elevating a woman, but elevating an Arab into the seat and the place of authority of one of the most, if not the most, high-profile men in the United States, because Matt's been at this for 20 years. Not just like the president's very influential, but he hasn't been influencing public policy and being the stated face, the most recognizable face, as Matt Lauer has been. This is all by the hand of God. If you're a woman, rejoice. If you're a man, rejoice. God is working. He's bringing good news to the ethnos, good news to the Arabic peoples, good news to the African peoples, good news to the Hispanic people, and good news to the Anglo people. And I've spoken to that. Listen, if you want to know more about that, go get my book on Amazon.com, The Next 50 Years of Prophetic Perspective, and I speak at length to many of this that will answer questions that have come up in your mind as you've listened to this. Now, let's conclude. What is a Christian response to be toward these things that we see? In ancient times when Samaria, which that was the 10 northern tribes, when Samaria went into captivity to the Assyrians, they went because of sin. And at that time, the southern kingdom of Judah, they rejoiced. And they considered that vindication of their rule, vindication of their kingdom in the south, because they saw the misfortune of the Samaritans in the north as being by the hand of God. But yet God saw it, and because they rejoiced over the misfortune of their brothers in the north, then they eventually likewise fell to the Babylonians and were taken into captivity. And their nation and their temple were likewise destroyed, even as Samaria. When we look around at the judgments and the chastisement of God poured out upon these, who, yes, they have, culturally they have, and the system they represent has systemically opposed and vilified and assaulted Christian values for years and denigrated our culture. And it's tempting for us as believers to rejoice over this, as the people of Judah rejoiced over the destruction of Samaria. That's highly that's highly unadvisable. The counsel of God in a time of judgment is to let your tongue cleave to the roof of your mouth. Let mercy and truth prevail in your thinking and in your words. Extend mercy to the undeserving, because you were undeserving likewise when God sent Jesus to die for you. Let truth prevail in your own situation by looking at yourself. Look at yourself personally. Look at the culture you and I are a part of. You know, Christian culture is not standing with pure hands and pure hearts when it comes to its own attitude toward women, sexual sin, and prejudice against marginalized peoples such as Arabs, Hispanics, African peoples, etc. What shall we say then? We look at what's happening, we correct ourselves, we humble ourselves, and we say, as expressed in Psalm 118:23, it is the Lord's work, and it's marvelous in our eyes. God bless you. If you'd like to know more about us, visit us at propheticnow.com. And you can also find our books available on Amazon if you search for my name, Russell Walden. God bless you.